For the election of 1860, it was incredibly clear that the nation was split, and this is reflected in the election. Now, this political cartoon here shows that each section sort of had its preferred candidate. And Lincoln, while we tend to think of him today as being abolitionist and wanting to get rid of slavery, his platform was truly about maintaining the Union. The Republican Party platform did promise not to interfere with slavery in the states, but it certainly did not want to extend slavery into the new states. The American public was more and more aware of this issue because of things like Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, because of the violence of John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, because of the Dred Scott decision. So this was a very important race, and everyone knew that. One problem is that the Democratic Party is split between Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. Because of that split, Lincoln and the Republicans are able to kind of take advantage of that and win the election. This is because not only does Lincoln win the West, but he also is able to win much of the North, and the North was heavily populated. So if you see here in this electoral map, there is a clear divide between the South, the border states, the western states, and the North altogether. One thing that makes this incredibly challenging is that in some southern states, the parties refuse to even put Lincoln's name on the ballot because the states run the election. So when Lincoln is elected, some Southerners are absolutely mortified. They've never even heard of this man as a presidential candidate, but only know that he doesn't like slavery. So this raises the question of secession. Will the Union continue? Now, this issue of secession had been brewing for quite some time, and we have the fire eaters versus the barn burners. Fire eaters would have been Southern Democrats. They were people who had been trying to push for secession for several years. And this term fire eater is a term that means someone who's hot-headed or has a temper. So you can see why that is associated with people who want to break away from their nation. The barn burners were Northern Democrats. They were people who wanted to split the Democratic Party or even eliminate the party altogether in order to get rid of the pro-slavery faction. And this comes from the idea that if you have a barn that is infested with rats, it might be easier just to burn the entire barn down to get rid of the problem. But secession was not a new concept. However, though, Southerners and Democrats in general just don't like Lincoln. They see him as, well, one, he was sort of an opponent of Stephen Douglas, which had been from their time back in Illinois. But many people really personally dislike Lincoln. And so as this issue of secession has now come to the front of everyone's mind, plus this hatred of Lincoln, one congressman tries to propose a compromise. So this is the Crittenden Compromise, and it would guarantee slavery in the slave states, the current slave states. And it would extend that Missouri Compromise line, the 3630 line, all the way across the nation. It would continue to prohibit slavery above, and it would allow slavery below. Now, this again kind of goes against the idea that California was already a state, so do you split it into two states? What would go on with that? In the South, this is fairly popular, at least in the Senate. But other Southerners think that this is not enough. This was introduced in mid-December of 1860, and it is pretty much dead in the water within 2 weeks. And while this is going on, South Carolina, the South Carolina Assembly, is meeting. And they are voting on secession. And on December 20th, they vote we are separating from the United States. And they called the election of Abraham Lincoln a hostile act. That the country voting for this man was a hostile act. In their secession document, they talk about the Declaration of Independence, they talk about the Constitution, but of course they leave out all references to all men being created equal and the whole idea of being endowed by your creator with certain rights. Now, because South Carolina had been part of the Union, now it's saying it is not, there are Union forces, the U.S. Army forces in the state. Now they are technically in hostile territory. So the commander of that unit, Robert Anderson, decides to take his units to Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is an island that is in Charleston Harbor, because he doesn't want to have to fight the South Carolina militia that is sort of closing in on this city of Charleston. At this time, James Buchanan is still the president. He's the lame duck president because Abraham Lincoln will not be inaugurated until March 4th. Buchanan doesn't want to use the United States Army against these seceding states because he thought that was unconstitutional. So this becomes quite a bit of wait and see what will happen.